Hello and welcome. The home fleet in Scapa Flow must have been a magnificent sight with so many ships and people aboard, and then literally thousands of people working onshore to support. And that raises the question, how did they all keep in contact so that when the time came for the fleet to sail, each ship knew exactly what to do? David Hobbs served in the Royal Navy for more than 30 years. He retired with the rank of commander. He qualified as a pilot for both fixed and rotary wing aircraft, and he made over 800 carrier landings, many of them by night. He's the author of more than 20 published works, and he's the acknowledged expert on British naval aviation. He's with us now to answer that challenging question. How did they control the fleet in the flow? David, welcome. Over to you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm glad you said it was challenging because it was. It was a complicated story. How many times have you seen in history books, the fleet sailed from Scapa Flow to meet the enemy? The fleet sailed to cover a convoy to North Russia. What does that actually mean? What did you have to do to sail a large fleet of different ships, battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, from the home fleet's main base in Scapa Flow? Next slide, please. This chart shows the flow as it was from late 1941 onwards, and you can see how complicated it is. The black lines across the flow show you where anti-torpedo nets were sunk to prevent anything that got into the flow attacking the main anchorage, which was in the center of the flow. You can also see on it controlled minefields outside the nets, indicator loops outside the minefields that would detect the magnetic anomaly of a ship, or usually possibly a U-boat, passing over them. There were chain link fences, nets across the eastern barriers to prevent motor torpedo boats breaking through to attack the fleet. Ringing around the flow, you can see there are anti-aircraft guns, coast defense guns, not shown here, but there would be barrage balloon sites. By Kirkwall, there's the Naval Air Station at Hatston, and this was about to be joined by another one at Twat and others throughout the Orkney mainland. To the southwest, you can see the naval base at Lyoness with the grounded battleship Iron Duke acting as a headquarters. You can see the islands there of Flotta and Farah giving shelter for the destroyer anchorage and the anchorages where store ships were placed. When the fleet sailed, orders had to be given for the precise timing of gates in the nets to be opened to allow the ships to pass through. The ships would have to be briefed on who would go first, the escort destroyers, then the big ships, or the other way round. The channels outside the main booms at Hoxa and Swither would have to be swept in case enemy submarines had laid mines in them. They'd have to be swept against moored mines with a sinker on the bottom and a wire holding a floating mine, or influence mines lying on the bottom that could be detonated by the magnetic signature of a ship or its acoustic noise. That would have to be coordinated with the passage of the fleet. The guns would have to be told what was happening. Patrol ships would have to be told what was happening. The barrage balloons would. Any aircraft that were patrolling in the aircraft would need to know that the fleet was out. Next slide, please. The Admiralty Staff Manual tells us that there are a number of ways in which the fleet can communicate. There's wireless telegraphy, long-range radio. Good, you can transmit around the world with it. Problem, those transmissions can be intercepted, listened to by the enemy, and so they have to be encoded. It takes time to code a message, it takes time to decode it, and the enemy might be able to decipher your code and make use of it. The aircraft you see here are Seafires on HMS Indomitable during 1943. She's anchored in the main fleet anchorage during the workup period. You can see an escort carrier beyond her, and you can see a fleet maintenance ship beyond that. The Flow is a very busy place all the time. These aircraft are about to be flown off while they're in harbour. I've included it because it's a rare colour image of the Flow, and it's actually a pretty good image of the Seafires as well. So all these aircraft are fitted with radio, voice radio. You can talk over it, a bit like a walkie-talkie. Lots of aircraft voice radio messages would tell enemy listeners that there was a carrier in the area and that it was flying its aircraft. All sorts of transmissions by wireless telegraphy and radio would tell the enemy whether the fleet was getting ready to go out. So you would have to keep transmitting from shore to make it sound as if the fleet was there at a constant rate of activity. Other means of communication are less long range but more secure. They include visual means, flashing lights, sending Morse by light. Semaphore, where a man or woman moves their arms in order to indicate letters of the alphabet. And flags. Flags have different meanings, hoisted from different yardarms, and would show what the ship was doing, what it wanted its boats to do, who was on board, and other meanings. Didn't need to be coded, and could be read by anybody within visual distance, assuming it's daylight and assuming we don't have fog or mist. About the most secure means of communication is cable. Cables were run out from the communications headquarters at WeFi to buoys in the Flow, to which flagships could be connected. That would enable the flagship to receive ordinary telephone messages, teleprinter messages. So the order that the fleet was to sail would probably come from the Admiralty War Room in London by teleprinter. You could also send telegrams. Mail was also important. Mail would be brought on board, and it wouldn't just be letters from families to the sailors on board. It would include Admiralty fleet orders, instructions on everything from what colour these Seafires ought to be painted to how to repair one of their guns, anything else. Rates of pay for sailors would all be promulgated in Admiralty fleet orders, and there'd be confidential orders on the way things would be done, up to and including convoy escort tactics. Also importantly, the Admiralty Hydrographic Office at Creech Barrow House in Somerset would send out chart corrections. In order to navigate safely in coastal waters anywhere, but especially in a fleet base like Scapa Flow, you would have to make sure that your charts accurately reflected what was there. We saw a chart right at the beginning, and that chart showed the positions of nets, minefields, and all sorts of things like that. If those were changed, then an immediate chart correction would have to be sent out, and the navigator's yeoman would have to make sure that charts were amended up to date. These could be either by printing pieces of paper to stick onto the chart, showing the new layout, or by hand amendments, which would be carried out and signed for. Next slide, please. This is at Line S. It shows a boom defense vessel alongside the jetty. You can still see there today, and it's hauling out of the boom defense structure ashore the floats that are going to support an anti-torpedo net. There are cranes to help maneuvering boom defense equipment, and to the right on the jetty you can see a buoy, lots of rusty cable, anti-torpedo nets piled up on the jetty. These are probably used nets and kit that need to be repaired, that have been brought ashore, and the net we see being attached to the boat is going to be towed out to replace them. Next, please. This is a boom defense vessel, Bar class ship, and it's actually deploying anti-torpedo net across the Flow. You can see the floats, they're obvious. At some point, there'll be another net that will link with it or across it to make a gate through which ships can pass to enter or leave the Flow. The bar boats were specifically built for working moorings. The horns at the bow can lift buoys, or the anchors and chains that hold them. After that, there's a king post and a derrick that can lift great chunks of kit from the water onto the deck to be worked on. Next slide, please. And these are some of the boom defence personnel in their working clothing ashore at HMS Pomona. There were several depots which helped to maintain the boom, and a lot of the buildings they used were converted to civilian purposes after the war and can still be seen. Next, please. This is a mine clearance vessel. It's actually a drawing I did when I was a midshipman, but it illustrates the point that you don't just say, go out and sweep the channel outside the Hoxha boom. It shows a minesweeper. It's towing wires astern of it. It's called an oropesa sweep because the big curve of wire you can see is known in naval terms as an oropesa. It's held at the right depth by an otter board, little wing-shaped structures that pull the wire down into the water with a float on the surface. So the wire between the otter board and the float will determine the depth at which the oropesa will run. You can see here it's snagged the cable of a floating mine, and that will run along the oropesa, which would have, for the want of a better word, knotted bits of wire in it, which will rub on the cable and break it. If it doesn't, there's a cutter at the end, a bit like a knife sharpener, which will pull the cable into pincers and break it off. Once the buoyancy wire is broken, the mine will float to the surface and can be shot by a marksman and blown up. Several minesweepers can work together, and you can see that the curve on the sweep wire gives the swept area. In order to sweep the area for a battleship and its task force to go through the booms, you probably need several minesweepers working together. In order to clear mines that were detonated by sound or magnetic influences, you'd need different cables that were towed over the stern. You might have to have a group of minesweepers, each doing each different one. Typical shabby German trick was to put mine counters on some of their mines so that they wouldn't be detonated by the first ship to go over them. They would need something could be set for 2, 3, 4, or 5 ships. So you'd probably need to sweep the swept channel several times in order to be pretty certain that it was clear. Next slide, please. Back on board Indomitable in flow, and the thing I want you to see here is the little ship with puffer that's going past it. It's a stores carrier. You can see it's got a derrick for lifting stores up onto a ship. In the case of a carrier or a battleship, its own crane could lift it up on board. It's delivered its cargo. You can see it's light in the water line's quite high out of the water. It's actually difficult to take a picture of the flow without seeing these ships working their trade backwards and forwards. Their orders were sometimes given by being given a typewritten route through all the ships that were in harbour, saying what stores had to be delivered to each one as it went round. Something that was vital or had to be a piece of stores that had to be delivered quickly in order to make a ship operationally ready for sea might be given a specific puffer to take it out to the ship. But normally there was a round robin delivering mail, people and stores to the ships. Next, please. This is a typical telephone buoy. You can see the cable which runs along the bottom of the flow and leads into an Admiralty cable network that actually spanned the globe. The buoy is held tightly in place by chains going down to anchors laid on the bottom by a boom defence vessel. The ship is attached to it by removing the anchor from one of its anchor chains, putting the anchor onto a bracket known as a clump cathead on the forecastle, attaching it to the ship, and then running the cable up over the forecastle and plugging it into the ship's telephone system and its exchange. So the exchange operator now has access to the full Admiralty telegraph telephone system. The Commander-in-Chief can talk to the people in the Admiralty War Room in the bunker under the Admiralty main building in London. Flagships had these. There were probably half a dozen across the flow. The most secure means of communication and probably the most immediate. Next, please. And this shows some of it in action. This is the battleship Duke of York. Commander-in-Chief, Home Fleet, Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser is on board. She's the flagship of the Home Fleet, and she's just returning to Scapa Flow after the Battle of North Cape on Boxing Day 1943. She's coming into the flow. You can see there's a barrage balloon up. Lots of these would have been flown in order to stop enemy low-flying aircraft, or to make it dangerous for enemy aircraft to fly over the flow at low level, because you can't see the wire dangling underneath them. There's a lot we can see in this picture. Duke of York's already put down one of her boats, visible over on the right, and that'll be collecting mail and important passengers to come out to the ship. You can see a lot of activity on the forecastle, and the forecastle party have already attached the anchor cable to a telephone buoy, and the telephone cable's already been passed up onto the forecastle. So they're already sending messages to the war room explaining what had happened, that the German battlecruiser Scharnhorst has been sunk. Amidships, you can see a crane turned out, and that'll be lowering more ship's boats to run a routine. And pretty soon now, she'll have fenders over the side, and oil tankers, ammunition ships, possibly a hospital ships, boats will be coming alongside in order to take off any wounded from the action, and in order to top up the ship's fuel supplies, re-ammunition it, and bring more food and vital stores on, on board. Next, please. Here's Indomitable again, more colour. And again, you can see there's a store ship going by her. Move back there. Another store ship going by, adding to the thing that you can't take a photograph of the flow without seeing one. You can still see the escort carrier over to the left. This store ship is bigger. She's got 2 king posts. She can carry up to 1,000 tons of varied stores on board and bring it right alongside even a big ship like a carrier or a battleship. Next, please. Communications would have to deal with virtually any eventuality. That could include operational orders to sail, the everyday logistical resupply of the ships, maintenance of the ships. Back, please. Or a royal visit. This is His Majesty King George VI visiting HMS Victorious when she returned to the flow after her aircraft had attacked and crippled the German battleship Tirpitz in Kafjord, northern Norway. In front of the king, to his left as you look, is Admiral Sir Bruce Fraser, the Commander-in-Chief of the fleet, and with him are the Captain of the Fleet, the Commanding Officer of Victorious, flag lieutenants, some of the King's equerries, and the lift driver stood by the brass handle, which is just behind him, which is how he's controlling the lift. So in this instance, there's a bar right the way down so that he could stop the lift at any point. But this is bringing the king up to the flight deck so that he can meet some of the aircrew who have fallen in to talk to him. Next, please. Communication. I've mentioned aircraft already with their radio. This is Miles Martinet of 771 Naval Air Squadron from the Royal Naval Air Station at Twat. It's a fleet requirements aircraft. It's used to provide targets for ships to shoot at. You don't just fire your weapons if you're an operational warship when you go out and happen to find the enemy. You've got to make sure that the direction crews, the guns crews, and every member of the ship's company is efficient and ready to fire accurately at a target. This might be at a floating target on the surface of the sea, without firing at aircraft that simulate enemy attacks on ships, or in this instance, at a sleeve target towed behind a tug. It wouldn't be this close to the aircraft when the ships open fire. It would be about 2,000 yards astern of it, it's a mile, and about 1,000 feet below it. In the aircraft would be a pilot and a winchman who would pay the sleeve out on a drum until it got into the correct operating position. There'd be a radar reflector on the sleeve, which would help gun direction systems lock onto it to guide the guns to open fire. And after the shoot, the aircraft would fly and drop the sleeve, and it could be examined to see how many holes there were in it from hits or near misses. As the war went on, radar direction system improved and became much better. So good, in fact, that occasionally they wouldn't lock onto the sleeve, they'd lock onto the wire and begin to track along it. So one of the radio transmissions that the pilot might have to make is stop shooting, it's getting dangerous. One of the famous calls being, remember, I'm pulling this target, not pushing it. Next slide, please. This is the Royal William Victualling Yard in Plymouth, and I include it to show what a naval base in the south, at the big bases at Portsmouth, Plymouth, Chatham, Sheerness, would have had to support the ships there. A yard like this would have provided food, bread, beer, rum, clothing, boots, crockery, any mess utensil you care to name, bedding, hammocks, sheets, anything like that. They'd be put into lighters inside the inner harbour or onto small store ships. This was one of the focal points, and stuff would be centred here and then taken by fleet auxiliaries in protected convoys to Scapa Flow. Next. To Line S, and this is Line S, where the base commander at Scapa Flow had to replicate everything that was being done at the Royal William and the other yards. In the foreground, you can see the base at Line S with its above ground fuel tanks. Behind us is the hill at Wee Fee, which contained fuel oil tanks carved out of the inside of the hill with 130 million litres of furnace fuel oil. The ships you see anchored off there are stores ships that have brought ammunition, victualling stores, naval stores, which could be anything from a nut and bolt to a replacement prop shaft or boiler, and fleet maintenance group sailors who could provide parties on board warships to help them with both routine maintenance, battle damage repair, and unexpected maintenance if something broke down. Beyond the store ships, you can see the island of Flotta, which gives you an idea of where we are. And this was also the destroyer anchorage. They would have gone out through the Switha booms rather than the Hoxha booms. Next, please. This is part of the Royal Naval Armament Depot at Ernesettle in Plymouth, near where I grew up as a small boy. The ammunition is stowed above this picture in the side of a hill. There's miles of tunnel built back into a hill full of everything from 15-inch shells, 1,000-pound aircraft bombs down to rifle bullets. They'd be put on pallets and brought out by little diesel cars onto this wharf into the River Tamar, then lifted by the crane you can see at its end into lighters, or lighters which would have their own cranes. They would then be towed to a safe place where warships would be moored and the ammunition could be loaded on board. Next, please. In the case of Line S, here we see both stores and ammunition ships anchored in the sound off Line S. To the right, you can see there's a maintenance ship with two destroyers alongside. Derricks are over the side and it's lowering stores or spare parts onto it. So there's a lot of work going on here. Over to the left, you can see a break bulk carrier with its derricks, which is unloading stores into small drifters. And right in the middle of the shot, you can see a drifter. the workhorse of Scapa Flow. There'd be hundreds of these working daily routines. Each one of the big ships, the battleships and carriers, would have one allocated to it to ferry people ashore and out to the ship, to carry spare parts, do anything literally that the ship wanted. And you can see there's a lot of shipping here. There's a lot going on. Next. One of the things you had to bear in mind with those stores ships was that you couldn't just pack the holds like this one or like a merchant ship, because anything needed to be identified, found, and then got out quickly. We take it for granted today that we can pull out a mobile phone, dial Amazon, and say, I want a lawn mower or a packet of hair curlers, and I want them tomorrow. Their digital control organization will go to the nearest warehouse, find them, put it in a packet, send it to you, and a van will pitch up tomorrow. Well, that had to happen in Scapa Flow between 1940 and 1945. So the store ships the Navy used couldn't carry as much bulk kit as an ordinary merchant ship, because you had to have racking and shelves in the holds. And then each shelf had to give access to the boxes stowed on it, which would have an Admiralty Stores reference number. So if a ship asked for a particular item, even if it was only a hydraulic system washer for a gun turret in the battleship Duke of York, it had to be found quickly by a stores rating, taken up and put in a boat and taken directly to the ship, or if it wasn't that urgent, taken on the round robin around the fleet. In this instance, it's a lighter, and it has been densely packed because it's carrying 40mm Bofors anti-aircraft ammunition out from Line S to the aircraft carrier Campania, which has just come back from an Arctic convoy escort mission, and it's fired out all its ammunition. So the lighter is packed as full of boxes as it can be, and they're being winched up onto the ship. Next, please. Duke of York again, and she shows pretty much all the short-range communications systems I've mentioned briefly. Slightly off the picture at her bow to the left, she'll be connected to an Admiralty telegraph cable. So her captain and command team will be talking to the war room in the Admiralty. On top of the bridge, if my learned friend can indicate, there's a sailor sending semaphore to a nearby ship. So that's one visual means of communication. It hasn't been formally taught for years, but a lot of communications ratings still teach themselves, because it's a fast and efficient way of saying, send a boat, has my boat arrived to the ship next door. Other means of communicating are flags. You can see flag hoists at both masts. They might mean all boats return to me. It's the sort of signal you'd put up if you were about to sail. Seen here, she's probably at 4 hours notice for steam, so there's nothing particularly urgent going on. The other means of communication are searchlights, which can be used as signal projecting lanterns. There are small ones in the bridge structure, bigger ones on the fore funnel, and really big ones on the after funnel, which can be used as searchlights to illuminate targets at night. The biggest ones can be used right out to the visibility distance, about 18 miles away. Work is going on. You can see the big turrets are trained fore and aft, but a turret right forward has its right-hand gun fully elevated to 40 degrees, and that would indicate that ordnance artificers are working on the turret. Next. And yet another of the ubiquitous store ships, close alongside the starboard side of Duke of York again, you can see the derrick has swung a load onto the deck. You can see the loose wire dangling from it, which shows that it's been put down. You can see the sailor in the foreground with an Admiralty pattern bomb trolley is carrying what's called a Clarkson case. It's a fiber tube in which there's the cartridge case, which would fire the 5.25-inch shell for the ship's secondary armament. You can see 2 turrets in the background. Each one has 2 barrels. The barrels can elevate individually, but only train with the turret. The shell, which weighed about 80 pounds, is separate. And the Clarkson cases will be stowed down in the magazine, and the shells will be stowed down in the shell room. In the action state, when the ship's going into action, the cartridges would be removed from the Clarkson cases, placed on hoppers, which would bring them up to the gun breech. The tray would force ram them in, and the guns were capable of firing about 12 rounds a minute. Stacked in the background, you can see cases of 2-pounder anti-aircraft ammunition. As the ships come in order to have everything ready, they would send what's called a logistic requirement signal in code to the base commander, and it would say how many tons of fuel they need, how much ammunition of what caliber they need, whether they have wounded men needing to be taken off, whether they need replacement sailors to be brought out from accommodation ships, how much food they need, and all sorts of other administrative details without which the fleet isn't going to function. Next. Where was all this coordinated? Where was the focal point of this communications system? And the answer is right here in the communications center at Wee Fee on the side of the hill. This is it as it is today. You can see the remains of Lyonesse Naval Base in the distance, with the jetties sticking out into the harbour, and you could just about make out the jetty where the boom defence depot was. The Wee Fee was blast proof, but not bomb proof. It contained the operations room, and this is where they masterminded, telling the ships the order they were to go out in, and telling everybody else what was happening. Telling lighthouses to put their lights on if it was dark and the fleet was coming in so that they could navigate. Putting lights on buoys so that they could navigate. Allocating berths to all the ships that came in. Making sure that all the drifters rang the correct routine. If I could draw your attention to a rusty stump on Wee Fee's roof there, we'll see more of that in a minute. Next, please. This is the staff at Wee Fee. 2 things to draw your attention to. Yes, there are some sailors, but the majority of people you see here are Wrens, members of the Women's Royal Naval Service. Why women? Because they underwent specialized training like the men, but when drafted to a job, they didn't go to sea. Therefore, they would be drafted, get used to a job, get good at it. Most of them were intelligent, thinking people from a good background who would rapidly pick up the job, and they would stay there for years and be the masters of what they did. Men, on the other hand, would undergo their training, come here, learn the job, and then be drafted to a ship. So you'd be constantly training new people, and your efficiency would be constantly dimmed by new people. By using the majority of Wrens, you were constantly at high efficiency. I mentioned all sorts of different ways of communicating. Here's another one. If you look to left and right, there are dispatch riders. One of the safest ways of making sure a message arrives at its destination is to give it to somebody and say, hand this to the captain of Duke of York. So in this instance, the dispatch rider would roar off down to the jetty at Lyonesse, hand the package to somebody, or even take it himself, out to the ship in question and give them those vital orders. Next, please. The rusted stump that you could see on the roof of Wee Fee is this mounting for a 20-inch signalling lamp. This is posed because you can see the flotter in the background. So she's not actually pointing towards the flow or shipping, but she's pointing it to give the photographer a good angle to get a shot at what she's doing. You notice she's got binoculars hanging around her neck. That means she can find her target. Once she's found it, she looks along a telescope on the side of her signal lantern, and with her right hand, she's controlling a shutter across the face of the lamp. It's an arc lamp, very bright, needed a lot of power. You can see the heavy cable running to it. And she's flashing with her right hand so that the shutter opens and shuts. So she's transmitting Morse letters. No need to code it. The enemy isn't going to see it. This is going to be visible at 10, 12 miles. The writer is writing down what she calls, looking through her telescope, that the person she's talking to, in naval parlance, is sending. So letter by letter. As each word comes in, she gives one flash to say, got it. Next, please. And inside Wi-Fi itself, this is the telephone exchange. Physical connection. Once you've plugged the wire in here, that wire leads out into the system. It could go out through a cable to a buoy to the battleship Duke of York. It could follow the Admiralty cable system to the nodal point at Rosyth and then into the Admiralty system, which led all over the world through underwater cables. System that was still in use in the 1970s. You still had to go through a telephone operator and ask for a number. Subscriber trunk dialing didn't come into the naval worldwide system until the 1970s. You can see here there are 7 operators. They're there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, non-stop. So a lot of the people you saw in the ship's company would have been telephone operators. The lady in the foreground, their back to us, is the supervisor. That's it. Is the supervisor taking charge of the whole thing. And there are more operators to the right of this picture. Overhead, there are some of the more commonly used numbers to make it easier for them to find. And this is going to be an absolute buzz of activity. I don't know for certain, but if you look right at the end of the line of operators, there's a man. I believe he's a post office engineer. If anybody had a problem with any of their sets, they'd stick their hand up. The post office engineer would come over and try and fix it immediately. This is the core of activity. So it's important here everything goes right, goes quickly. Next, please. Ending up where I've started and just mentioning those chart corrections again, arriving by mail. Charts would be for very specific small areas, larger areas, really large areas. All of them would show minefields, danger areas, spoil grounds, wrecks, and a lot of other important things. So it was important that they were really kept up to date with new bits pasted on them, etc. I was going to leave this up while I ask if anybody's got any questions. I'll give it a minute or so and then put my vision back on and see if I can have a go at answering them. I'm conscious of the fact that I've barely scratched the surface, but I hope what I've done is stimulate your interest for what was a wonderful organization. It was complicated. I still don't fully understand the limits of it, but it shows you what went on at Scapa Flow in order for the fleet to operate. If any individual bits, from the rustiest drifter to the coal-fired bar boat tugging its bit of netting out, to the orders they'd been given on a typewritten sheet for that day, if any of that had gone wrong, the whole thing would have collapsed. So I hope that's been interesting. Thank you very much for giving me your attention.
And thank you indeed, David. That is totally fascinating. And there's a number of questions that have been coming in. And I'd also like to bring in Ian Brown, who was with us earlier, speaking about radar at Netherbutton. And the defensive role of Netherbutton was very much part of the overall defences that you've been describing so well. I'd like to ask a thought, just thinking that last point you said about the importance of every piece in that whole structure. There's that famous quote of Napoleon about an army marching on its stomach, the importance of food supplies to an army. Is it fair to say that a navy sails on its eyes and ears?
Yes, yes. I mean, well, it's now called situational awareness, and it is everything. if you understand where your enemy is and what he's doing, that's half the battle. A lot of the problems that were encountered in the past were lack of knowledge, both about where the enemy was and where your own fleet was, actually.
And that knowledge would be very much enhanced by the story that Ian was telling us earlier about Netherbutton. And Ian, can I bring you in and ask, in this huge mesh, this huge web of communication that we've been hearing about, the communication links between Netherbutton and the fleet, and I guess wee Fee as well, must have been important.
Well, indeed, it's all very well having detection systems, but it only operates if you can make use of that information. And I mean, in some respects, the classic example of that was the attack on Pearl Harbor, which obviously came as a huge surprise, but actually there were fairly rudimentary mobile radars set up round the island, and one had picked up the incoming Japanese aircraft, and they had the equivalent of filter rooms at Fort Shafter in Honolulu. The information was flowing through, but it only operated until I think it was 7 o'clock in the morning. So when they phoned through, they were told to. There was one guy that still happened to be on duty, and he said, "Oh, don't worry," because they were expecting some bombers coming in from the US mainland. They said, "Oh, don't worry about it, it's fine." And the rest, as they say, is history. But it's very much about not just getting the information, but making use of it, having the communication links to get that information to the people who will make the strategic decisions, whether it's on board a ship or at the Admiralty or the War Office or the Air Ministry in London. And there was a huge communications network across the whole UK set up just specifically to deal with these sorts of communication matters.
And Ian, and David, rather, can I go back to you and ask, there's a tremendous amount of activity you showed us, all kinds of ships moving around the flow, drifters communicating, and in particular ammunition being moved. Were there any particular points at which vulnerability to attack from the air was particularly important, and people on the ground and on the flow itself were particularly sensitive and particularly aware?
Two things. To give you an idea, I said there was a lot of it. To give you an idea what a lot was, we saw Duke of York coming back after the Battle of North Cape. Each of her main guns had 100 rounds of ammunition in the magazine. So that's a total of 1,000 rounds of ammunition, and that would weigh 710 tons. When she came, and the ship also carried a full tank of fuel, was 3,850 tons. So shortly after we saw her arriving at her buoy, lighters and ships would be snapped alongside, bringing on board about 600 tons of ammunition and about 2,500 tons of fuel before you start looking at tons of food, bread, drinkable water, rum, and all the rest of it. So you're talking huge quantities. You noticed where I mentioned the jetty at Ernesettle as an example that ammunition was stowed in lighters. And that, I believe, was the case off Lyoness. Rather than try and build an enormous ammunition depot into the side of a hill, which would have taken years, the ammunition was stowed in lighters at sea. So had there been an air attack on it, there would have been a big bang and a lot of smoke, but it wouldn't have caused a great deal of damage away from the line of lighters. For non-perishables, lighters were a very good idea. So things like fuel and ammunition, spare bits of metal and machinery could be kept in lighters and then brought alongside the ship when necessary.
And the picture you showed and the description of the drifters was particularly interesting, because it's almost like a mini navy of drifters. And I wonder, how did they manage to recruit them? Where did they get them? Was it, for instance, spread out around the fishing ports?
They were drifters and trawlers taken up from trade, and a lot of their ship's companies, or the sailors, were taken up with them into the RMVR. So there was a rank of skipper for the skipper of a drifter, and his sailors would be pretty much the same people who had run it as civilians.
Something else I wanted to ask, it's Lyoness itself. Now, a generation, a post-war generation, grew up just seeing the last remnants there. So it was almost like a wasteland, fairly bleak. Looking at the sheer scale of it, that's almost a town.
Oh, it would be bigger than some small cities. Yes, it was. I mean, you're talking thousands of people, not all of which were accommodated at Lyoness. There were, I can't remember the name of one of them now, but there were old liners that were taken up from trade and moored in the flow purely to act as accommodation ships. You needed, in order to have instant replacements available to replace battle casualties, an accumulator, if you like, in order to be able to replace people quickly with someone. And that meant having people on the spot waiting to be sent forward.
And also the flags are interesting. Now, there will be people watching who remember the first Stromness shopping week in 1949 and this wonderful decoration across the street of flags. And at the time, I'm sure many people would not have realized that those flags actually came from Lyoness. They were very, very big, very, very heavy. And what's interesting, there were so many different types of flag.
There is a basic alphabet of flag, but they have different meanings. So a flag flown from the port yardarm might mean one thing, from the starboard yardarm something else. But there's some fairly standard ones. A red flag would mean I am taking on or discharging ammunition. A white and blue flag alpha would mean I have divers over the side of the water. Please go past me slowly, that sort of thing. So those would be the everyday ones. Red and white stripes means the ship is out of routine. But there would be others that would have more immediacy. All boats return quickly. In other words, we're getting ready to go. Get back here. That would probably be backed up by sounding the siren. When you think how big the flow is, miles across, if the flagship said, I want my boats back, that was a pretty long flog that they had to go to get there.
I was just also thinking about the way technology has changed, because of course today the communication would be about whether it's mobile phone or so on, but there is also the snag with electronic communication today that monitoring is also very much increasing. So could it be indeed that there are situations even today when signaling by flashing light, even semaphore, is not just something old-fashioned, but it's something that's actually got practical benefit?
Oh, there are huge practical benefits, because once you begin to delve into the depths of it, one of the things an enemy can do, the obvious one, people latch onto Bletchley Park deciphering enemy codes. But there's a whole lot you can do even without breaking an enemy code by monitoring the amount of traffic. Oh, look, all of a sudden, there are an awful lot of aircraft radio sets transmitting. Maybe there's an aircraft carrier in Scapa Flow. Maybe it's working up. Oh, look, there are a whole raft of ships transmitting on short-range tactical radios. So in order to spoof the enemy, there were systems set up as the war went on in order to maintain a high level of tactical radio traffic all the time, so that the enemy couldn't pick out when there was an event like the fleet sailing or coming in, or an aircraft carrier working up in the vicinity. people got more and more used to actually working without radio transmissions, working silent, using flags, flashing lights, semaphore, cable transmissions, and all the rest of it. It's a bat and ball game trying to defeat the enemy and make him think one thing. But don't write off signal traffic as a means of finding out what your enemy is doing.
And just to go over to Ian about this subject of signal traffic, from the point of view of the radar at Netherbutton, it's playing a vital role in the defense of the flow because it's looking out, it's anticipating the possibility of attack from the air. Does that mean that every day there would be a lot of dialogue, a lot of to and fro conversation, requests between Netherbutton and between a key point like Wi-Fi in the flow?
Yeah, I mean, radar stations were all in contact with, I mean, certainly the RAF ones, like Netherbutton, the main contact point would have been the filter room at the RAF fighter group headquarters at Inverness. So for most of the war, that's where, certainly in the early days it went to Wick, but then for most of the war it went to Inverness. So they would have been, basically had an open phone line, so the radar operator would have had a chest and headset, so they would have had a sort of speaker right in front of them, and they would have, even if there wasn't any aircraft to report, they would still have been in conversation with them. And in fact, I mean, there's stories of friendships and even romances starting remotely over these phone lines, because they had to keep in contact to ensure that the line was working, because if you only phoned up when there was something to report, it might be that the communication failed at that particular point. So by staying in contact, they knew that the line was operational when they needed it.
And something, when we spoke earlier, Ian, we talked about the sheer speed and the sheer scale of what's done. That really comes out again today in David's talk, doesn't it?
Well, indeed. I mean, just think how much, even in 1940s terms, it would cost to pay, the daily wage pay of every single person working at Lioness. Because I mean, for a radar station like Netherbutton, there would be about 140-ish people working there. The airfields, I think it was more like about, so somewhere like Hatson, you'd probably have maybe about 2,000-ish. I mean, I have no idea what Lioness would have been, but yeah, I mean, it'd be more like tens of thousands, presumably, rather than,
certainly in the thousands, yeah.
Exactly. And by the time you include all the personnel on the lighters and things supporting that, just the daily cost in terms of pay must have been astronomical. So yeah, it's hard to kind of get your head around the scale of it all.
And they moved everything into place so quickly, because I was just thinking, if this was the present day, how long it would take, how many years it would take to put into position something with that enormous structure, with the Wi-Fi, with the oil tanks, with the communication center. My goodness, it's just the speed in which everything was put into place.
To be fair, I mean, Wi-Fi, the fuel tanks there, took years to make. They're an enormous undertaking. But the wake-up call was the Abyssinian crisis, when we deployed a fleet to Alexandria in order to implement the League of Nations sanctions against Italy. The Admiralty realized the need for rapid logistic support. So there were things like depot ships were ordered and built in the late 1930s and were just coming into service. And there were a lot of plans for taking up ships from trade in order to convert them into heavy repair ships, accommodation ships, and that sort of thing. and they were implemented in pretty much the same sort of way that they were for the Falklands War. And I was involved with the conversion of merchant ships into something the Navy could use during the Falklands War. And in 10 days, I think it was, the Atlantic conveyor was converted from a standard cargo ship carrying boxes into a ship that could carry and operate both helicopters and, to an extent, could launch vertically, the Sea Harrier, and carry thousands of tons of stores. All of that was done in a Royal Dockyard in 10 days. So the latent capability is there if you've got people with the drive to force it through, and we've done it. What goes wrong is the normal peacetime, oh, let's not take a decision now, we'll put it off until next year. The thing I always quote as an example of haste is one of the ships I was involved with was the cruise liner Queen Elizabeth, and the staff requirement was to provide a helicopter pad capable of operating 3 Sea Kings. And I went down to Southampton, was talking to some of Cunard's constructors, and we had a table laid out on it with diagrams of the ships. And I said, you would need to cut down at frame, whatever it was, 300, and then remove all the superstructure after it in order to put flat plates on to make a flight deck. And the constructor said, that's feasible, we can do it. And I said, so that's the plan, we're going for this. My pencil jottings on their drawing. And as he said, agreed, a technician lit an oxyacetylene torch and started cutting steelwork on the upper deck of Queen Elizabeth. Now that, for me, is how you get things done in the defence world, not by setting up a committee to look at whether you ought to have a committee to look at whether there should be a requirement in 20 years' time. I mustn't be political.
Is it just one general question to sum up? Is it the question, where, as you've described the role of all these individuals and how important it was that each individual carried out a task, however small, is it the question that on the one hand, you need people with a lot of skills, and on the other hand, character, integrity and reliability are also vital?
Admiral Fraser, the bloke I pointed out with the King, he loved the service and the sea, and he would wander around the mess decks of his ships with his pipe and talk to the sailors. And he always said he recognized their skills and they recognized and loved him. It's a team effort. Everything you do is a team effort. And if you don't work as a team in whatever you do, you're not going to succeed.
David, absolutely fascinating. The presentation, it's just another world you brought to light. The questions were most interesting. And Ian, thank you so much for joining us as well. Thank you indeed to the two of you. Just before rounding off, I should say that tomorrow is the second part of celebrating Scapa Flow, where we look at the wrecks in and around the flow. That's at 2 o'clock. And then after that, we go ashore to Bursey and HMS Tern and the ongoing preservation work. In the meantime, to David and to Ian, to the technical team of Swain and John behind the scenes, warmest thanks indeed. And to viewers, thank you and good night.
Good night, Ian. Good night, Howie.
Thank you.
Right.